It's quite amazing to look back at the AIDS epidemic and the original, one of the first that we called the 076 trial. It was the fetal transmission trial, where the idea that you would give women AZT to prevent it from, from transmission in children. And we had no idea that it worked. So in hindsight, it's very, very different. That trial was reviewed and approved, reviewed at Children's. And I'll never forget, it was so contentious. It's an interesting story. It was so contentious that our IRB actually turned it down. We voted against it after a lot of discussion. And this was one of these things that you don't like to happen in an IRB, but unfortunately, somehow, how people voted got outside of the IRB. And to the point where the investigator somehow got information about who voted what way. I mean, this is an IRB's nightmare. And I lived through that nightmare. And so the person who was running that trial knew who voted which way. And there were people, IRB members, that were being lobbied, the people who were voted, against it. It was a mess. It was an absolute nightmare. The end result, right or wrong, was that there at a later date there was a resubmission. There was some other data that came in also at the time that it was reconsidered, and it eventually was passed at the hospital. I hate to think that breach of confidentiality caused a reconsideration. I think there are other factors. I think probably it would have been brought back to us for some other reasons. I think that may have certainly fueled things. But that was sort of, and it was passed, and we did do the trial. And as we all know, these were very important trials because it did reduce the transmission of HIV to infants. So I remember that very, very well. Now, in the field in general, I do remember, this was the time when the FDA, when the AIDS activists lobbied very hard, very ardently, because many times, and this was not children, although it may have been some children, the only way you could get care was to get on a trial with drugs. And there were stories of people, of investigators, falsifying data on patients to be able to get them access. So there was all of that going on in the community. But the important thing is that FDA, this was the time when FDA started to recognize the need to find other mechanisms to get drugs to people quicker. And so a lot of the quicker, fast path mechanisms that we have today, so that you can allow certain drugs to be used, an investigational drug, once you have a certain amount of data on a trial, or other types of compassionate use or fast track ways. That was all based on the HIV epidemic and the activism of those with HIV. And I think it served us well. It was just for HIV, but there are many other diseases and diagnoses that are as important, where people don't have other options and do want access to investigational drugs earlier than waiting for all the trials to be completed. And I just remember thinking about that and thinking about, is this a good thing? They're allowing other paths to get drugs, but we don't have the data yet. And sort of thinking in my mind, do we have to, the issue of, protect or someone's right if they understand that it hasn't been approved but want it. And that tension still exists today in many things. It's, part of the pendulum that has swung from protectionism to your right to, your extreme right to have access to investigational drugs. And there have been lawsuits trying to do that. But the AIDS epidemic really sort of brought that to the forefront, and also in a very good way did allow the FDA to have new channels to allow drugs to be accessible to individuals sooner. So that was a good thing. but I remember it clearly.